Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations, the official podcast of the Ohio Counseling Association, bringing you updates and conversations from around the state. On today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Katie Gamby. Dr. Gamby is a licensed professional clinical counselor supervisor, a certified wellness counselor, a professional life coach, and yoga instructor with a PhD in counselor ed. In this conversation, we'll dive into the challenges faced by new practitioners in private practice, a topic that Dr. Gamby is passionate about as she frequently consults on issues like practice management and insurance reimbursement. And we'll also discuss wellness, which is at the heart of Dr. Gamby's work, both in her research and her clinical practice. She'll talk about what drew her to this topic, how she defines wellness, and why it's such a crucial aspect of our profession. We'll also discuss ways we can create more equitable and accessible definitions of wellness. Whether you're a seasoned professional, a student, or just curious about the world of mental health, this episode is packed with insights you won't want to miss. And as usual, I'm your host today, Dr. Marisa Cargill, a counselor and counselor educator in Northeast Ohio. Let's get started. Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations. I'm your host, Dr. Marisa Cargill, joined today by Dr. Katie Gamby. Katie, we're so happy to have you. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome.
Thank
Welcome.
you.
Yeah, so, we normally start off all of our conversations by just asking the guests to share a little bit about themselves and their experiences. So please tell our listeners all about Dr. Katie Gamby.
Yeah. So you know my name already. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor supervisor in our beautiful state. I'm also a certified wellness counselor, and I founded the Wellife, which is a private practice that resides in North Canton, Ohio. In general, like background in terms of education, I have a PhD in counselor education. And around 15 years of experience in mental health and higher ed kind of combined, and specialize in trauma informed practices, life transitions, and helping people specifically navigate anxiety, grief, relationship issues is my favorite, boundaries, and spiritual challenges. And I started my private practice really to create a holistic space where both clients and the clinicians that serve them can thrive through our focus on holistic well-being. So that's just something I'm really passionate about, and I'm sure we'll get into more as we talk today. And then just personally, I've really never met a cuisine I don't like, so love food. And I generally consider myself a homebody. I love being at home and an introvert. So my introvert people, I get you. And I understand that life. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you. I think
Yeah.
you're one of the first guests who talked about being a foodie.
I
So,
love food.
I mean, we need it, right? But also,
Yes. But it's
so
delicious when you like try all different kinds. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Um, I am also a counselor educator, and one of the
Mhm.
classes that I teach often is like our career development. And so I'm always so fascinated by how people get into this career. So, do you mind sharing a little bit about like your journey into the field of counseling and
Yeah.
wellness?
That's such a good question. So I started the journey into what I'm doing now back in 2011, right out of undergrad. So I had my undergraduate degree in psychology, but
Mhm.
I really loved higher education. I loved my undergraduate experience. And so I really just wanted to hang out in higher education a little longer, I think. And so my first job out of undergrad was at Bowling Green State University. Um, and that job actually afforded me to try out grad school for free because they had a reciprocity agreement with the University of Toledo. And that's where I was living at the time in Toledo. And what's funny is I remember having conversations with my professors in undergrad, and they kept saying to me, "You really should go to grad school. You should really go to grad school." And I was adamant that I would never go to graduate school, which is really funny now looking back. But I was just like, "No, I don't need it." Here we are.
Yeah.
But hindsight's 2020. But it was really great because I got to have an opportunity to continue my education without taking on loans and that burden. So, the way in really was I was thinking, "Oh, man, it might be cool to be an academic advisor in higher
Mhm.
education." I loved, working with students and, thought, that might be a cool job to help people figure out how to get their degrees. So when I was looking into going that career route, I recognized that you needed a master's degree first and foremost. But the master's degree for a lot of those jobs was either a master's in higher education or a master's in counseling, which I thought was interesting.
Mhm.
And quite practically, I went the counseling route because I thought, well, I feel like higher getting a master's degree in higher education is pretty like narrow, and getting a master's in counseling, I could do lots of different things. I could do academic advising, but I could also do other things with the counseling degree if I didn't end up wanting to be in higher ed forever. So I ended up going the counseling route and just so happened to pick the University of Toledo because that was what was near me. And then
Yeah.
fell in love with counseling and then never ended up doing academic advising at all and just ended up going the counseling route and the rest is kind of history. So it's kind of funny how you think you have a plan and then the plan changes, but I'm really grateful for the education I got there.
Yeah, yeah, it feels like a common thread for a lot of folks where it's like I had this one direction, but then when I got there, I was like, wait a minute. I
Right.
think I went the other way.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And it seems like it sort of came full circle in some ways because you did end up in higher ed with counselor ed.
Sure. Yes, I did end up there. So after my master's, I was afforded the opportunity to continue getting my doctorate. That wasn't really ever the plan right out of my master's, but again, it was just an opportunity and I took it. And I really loved teaching for so long. So yeah, I was really grateful for that experience too. So yeah, these situations kind of dropped into my lap, and I don't take that for granted because I know that that's not everyone's experience. But I just kind of kept saying yes. I'll try that. I'll do that. And I can always say no if I end up not liking it. So, but I just kept liking it. So I just kept kind of walking through those open doors.
Yeah, yeah. And so it snowballed into 15 years in higher education,
Yeah. Yeah.
9 years as a professor,
Mhm.
and then some transition into private practice full time more in the more recent past few years. Am I right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. How like has that kind of all, I guess, come to pass and influenced your approach to counseling?
yeah, that's such a good question. So, I always had my private practice throughout all of the time I was working as a professor, and I started my private practice actually right after I graduated with my master's. And I know a lot of people act as if you can't start a private practice with an LPC, but you can, and I did. Um,
Right.
so I was seeing clients consistently, even in higher education, even when I was a full-time professor, but
Mhm,
very, very sparingly, probably like 8 clients a week.
mhm.
Um, and I really decided last year, so it's been a year, to transition into full-time private practice because that was kind of always the dream. I always wanted to own my own practice. I always wanted to create a space for clinicians to be able to, I don't know, focus on their own health and well-being while they're also seeing clients. I noticed that that was a real big challenge for a lot of people that I was rubbing shoulders with. So, um, yeah, I think the transition out of higher education was really bittersweet for me because it was something that I had done my whole entire career. So it was a bit nerve-wracking, honestly, to transition out. I think
Yeah.
I have nothing but respect for professors. They're asked to do so many things with such little time. But for me specifically, after COVID, the landscape just changed so much, and I was teaching mostly online. I don't think I ever went back in person after COVID,
Oh, wow.
and yeah, so 4 years, and just everything was so different for me, and so I really just missed the face-to-face experience, and I missed the mentorship that I had with students in person, and then I was also noticing in my private practice that I had wait lists out the door, and I was like, "You know what? I think for me right now, serving people who need help in this way feels like where I'm called right now. So, yeah, I decided to transition out. Again, yeah, it was bittersweet, and also so thrilled with the decision because I didn't really know how it was going to go, to be honest. I was kind of worried, like, never done full time counseling. Am I going to like that? I don't know.
Mhm.
But I literally love it. I can't imagine doing anything else with my time and energy. So, yeah, I really enjoy it. And in terms of like the shift and how that's impacted my approach to counseling, besides counseling just more than I did before, I'm not really sure it has, but I do think, the best counselor educators are the ones that are able to take the like work that they do with clients and translate it to the students. And I recognize not all counselor educators can afford, they don't have time and energy to do that. But I do
Yeah.
think that that's really important, especially as we're, teaching the next generation of counselors. Um,
Mhm.
but, because I was always working with clients, the shift I've mostly made is to try to figure out how to keep scratching the itch of like teaching and mentoring without being in the higher education setting. And quite honestly, it's like TBD, to be determined, to be
Yeah.
continued. I don't really know yet. But those are the kinds of things that I loved about higher education that I still want to engage with, but I'm just, yeah, not sure exactly how to do that just yet.
Mhm.
So yeah, still figuring it out.
Yeah, it sounds like in some of the stuff that you shared with us in like our preparation for today's conversation, you shared with us a lot, and I've heard this from other folks too. So you have a good reputation. That you're consulting with other clinicians about building their own private practice, and so there's some of this educational piece that's happening with other clinicians still. Um, can you tell us more about that and maybe some of the challenges you see new practitioners facing?
Yeah, you're right. So I get to rub shoulders with people who are trying to figure out how to start their own private practices, and it's just really exciting. And because I've walked this journey before, it's fun to be able to help people navigate all of the intricacies of that. But I think the biggest challenge is honestly just lack of information. No one in graduate school tells you how to start a private practice, how to manage one, how to bill, what an MPI is. And so a lot of times students come into the programs, even the ones I was directing or teaching in, and they would say, when I asked them, what do you want to do after, you have your master's? They'd say, I want to start my own private practice. And quite honestly, my heart would drop when I would hear that, not because I didn't think they could do that, but I just knew we wouldn't be teaching them how to do that. And so, people understandably so get really overwhelmed. Where am I supposed to start? What am I
Mhm.
supposed to do first? And then they also, secondly, compare themselves to other people who've been doing this for a really long time. So they think to themselves, oh, I'm supposed to be somewhere that they're really not supposed to be, or, most people have worked
Mhm.
years to get to. And so I think oftentimes the information is really just gate kept by people and not shared. And maybe it's not even gate kept, but it's just not offered in a way that like people are used to. Hey, do this first, then this, then this, then this. And so, yeah, I think just not knowing where to start is a big thing. So, um, and then the other thing too is I think dependently licensed clinicians, so those in our state with an LPC, they often think, oh, I'm going to go work for this private practice and then I'll learn there how to function and open my own. And that's usually not the case because larger private practices are cropping up and they kind of work more like an agency setting where someone is doing the billing for you, someone is scheduling your clients for you, and you're kind of just seeing clients. And a lot of people want that, and that's great. But also, a lot of people think that, oh, if I go here and get some experience, then I'll know how to start a private practice. And that just doesn't usually translate either. So I tell people like my advice is just find someone who's done it before and then like ask, hey, can you mentor me? I've written a class specifically called Starting a Private Practice in Ohio that people can find on my website. But if people don't want to even use that, like just find someone that's done it before and have them walk you through how to do it step by step. Um, And then additionally, I tell people if you ever want to own your own private practice, it's a really good idea to never sign a non-compete agreement with anyone because then you'll be stuck working for them and you won't be able to leave without leaving and having to go a pretty far distance away. The good news about that, though, is that non-competes should be banned federally beginning September 1st of this year, 2024. So hopefully that'll be less of a problem moving forward and people will have more agency over what they decide to do.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like in your own learning, you saw like the void
Yes.
of formal training about starting your own private practice. And um, I like to demystify things. So you mentioned they may not know what an MPI is. Can you tell us what an MPI is?
Yeah, so it's called a national provider identification number. So in essence, all it is it's just how health insurance companies identify you from someone else. So it's like a social
Yeah,
security number for you for your
exactly. I
healthcare.
was looking
Yeah.
for the driver's license number, like, but for your professional license,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I didn't learn that till just a few years ago,
Right.
see, and
Right.
yeah.
Well, and all of you, if you're working and someone's billing for you, you probably have one and you just don't know you have one.
Yeah, which is even weirder,
Right,
right? It's,
right.
like, all about, like, these mysteries, and so,
Mhm.
trying to demystify some of that is wonderful. I'm glad that you saw that void and are helping to serve.
Yeah.
Um, what advice, if there's anything you haven't mentioned yet, like, do you feel like you'd like to offer newer folks trying to get into private practice?
Wow, that's a good question. I think it can be really easy, and this kind of feels weird because I'm also giving advice, but it's easy to get kind of bombarded by everyone's path and their journey and how they got there, and then, "Oh, well, this person did that thing first, and then they think that that path's best, and then this person thinks that path's best," and it kinda gets noisy sometimes. So,
Mhm.
even though I'm giving advice and I'm saying don't take everyone's advice, but I'm imagining that it's best usually for you to try to hear people's stories, their perspectives, where they come from, follow people's journeys and take the advice, but don't always recognize that you're going to follow every single one. We all have our path and journey and getting where we're going. And so, I guess I'd say like take all of the stories and the paths and the journeys that you're hearing with a grain of salt. Like you don't have to follow everyone's exact pathway, because you're an individual person and you know, you'll have a different journey than anyone else. So, kind of stay true to like what you believe to be true and what you know to be true about yourself. Sometimes it's nice to do like a little value sort around, hey, who's the kind of person I want to be through this process? So that can kind of ground you into that and give you kind of an intention to follow. But yeah, I would just say like it gets kind of noisy with everyone's perspectives and ideas. And so if you can kind of cut through some of that and just, keep going on your journey, I think that's usually the key.
Yeah. Take what fits, but know, like, your path is yours.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Um, you mentioned like wellness is a big part of your practice, and then you're a
Mhm.
certified wellness counselor. And you've done some research in this area, right?
Yeah.
What drew you to that topic of wellness specifically?
Yeah. So I think for me, I inherently always kind of knew, I think some of us just like know things in our
Right.
bellies, for lack of better words, that there
Yeah.
isn't an all like a one size all fit up, like, here's this one thing and it fits everybody approach to healing. And I've always been really interested and fond of other views and perspectives, particularly like other cultural understandings of holism to feel, you know, I think those perspectives feel really grounded to me. And, when I was looking at the research in the United States in particular, I think we've made amazing strides in medicine, but sometimes we sometimes get this like disengagement with the whole person thing. And that always just felt a little bit off to me. I just even remember some conversations I would have with professors at the University of Toledo, and I'm not gonna get into those necessarily, but it was just always confusing to me. Like I would bring up yoga, and at that time in 2013, it was like poo pooed as like that's not going to work. And I was always just like kind of confused by that perspective. So I kind of always had that in the back of my head, like this feels important. And so that just made me get interested more and more in how counselors understand wellness and how we
Yeah.
kind of practically engage with it in our therapy sessions. And I think the biggest challenge in my mind is that because we live in the United States, like the majority groups have often kind of co-opted other cultural practices, whitewashed them,
Mm,
repackaged it, and then are selling it back to us. And honestly,
yeah.
to the same cultural groups that like gave it to us so freely. So that all feels just inherently wrong to me. So that's where I kind of started. And I've always kind of been like, oh, I don't like that. So I wrote an article with Dr. Dominique Burns and Dr. Kaitlyn Forristal on decolonizing wellness in particular, just to start to bring light to that issue because I think, we start with like Hitler in the
Mhm.
1980s, but wellness has been something that has been around since the dawn of time. And I think it's important that we recognize where it comes from and root ourselves back into that history.
Mhm. Mhm. I appreciate that you use the term root, right?
Yeah.
Like that special and appropriate in the context of wellness. Um, Speaking of, how would you say like you specifically or personally define wellness?
I define it the way Jane Myers defines it because she's like the pinnacle of the wellness movement, I feel like, in our counseling field. And I feel like with her passing came like a kind of stops somewhat to the wellness conversation. I see people picking it back up, but she was just like the forerunner. So she defines wellness as a way of life oriented toward optimal health and well-being where our mind, body, and spirit are integrated by each individual to live more fully within the human and natural community. And then ideally, it's the optimum state of health and well being that each individual is capable of achieving. And I love that because I think that, first of all, she notes that wellness is not just physical health. And that's something that I think we oftentimes focus a lot on at the detriment to other facets of well being. I also think
Mhm.
in this definition, she acknowledges that holistic nature. Again, she's saying mind, body, spirit. It's not just body, it's not just mind. Um, and so there's that integration piece in those different areas. And then additionally, I think she recognizes that we're focused on living more fully, not just for ourselves, but for our communities too. Like there's an interdependence between how I'm, taking care of myself and the impact on my community and how my community and the wellness of my community impacts me. And so I think that's really important because it recognizes that it's not just the individual's job to take care of their wellness. And I think that that sometimes becomes the focus at the lack of talking about how the systems that we're in oftentimes don't
Mhm.
necessarily help us engage with that very well.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I think she recognizes that wellness is an optimal state that each individual is capable of achieving. So I think we get that wrong a lot where we have in our mind, this is what wellness is. And then the
Mhm.
standard is applied to all of us across the board in the exact same way. And that's just
Yeah.
wrong because everyone has different abilities, capabilities, seasons of life they're in, intersections, and that all impacts our ability to achieve well-being for ourselves at any given time. So I think it's important that we recognize that what's well for me might not be well for you and vice versa. And that's, I think, what makes us beautiful.
Yeah, and on any given day, that could also be different.
1000%.
Yeah,
1000%.
it's so dynamic.
Yeah.
Okay, I love that. You talk about this interdependence between community and individual, and I appreciate that so much because I think we, with the podcast, try to talk about our professional community
Mm.
so much. What do you feel like makes the topic of wellness so meaningful within the counseling profession?
Yeah, well, I thought it was wild that I was graduating with my master's in 2014, and that was when the consensus definition of counseling was published. So I went through my whole master's program kind of confused on what a counselor was. They were trying their best, but we didn't have a
Yeah,
real definition that we were all kind of behind. And so
sure.
once I read that in my doctoral program, because I started the same year in my doctoral program, I read that and I was like, this is why all this matters. And this is how I can create a professional identity. So, because counseling is a professional relationship that empowers diverse individuals, families, and groups to accomplish mental health, wellness, education, and career goals, then wellness becomes who I am, what I do. And I'm like, what I'm supposed to do as a counselor is help people achieve that or work toward that. So it's important because it's our professional identity at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's in our definition.
Yeah.
That's great. I didn't even think about that in the context of like graduating
Yeah.
without that. Maybe it's just because my age is like making me forget. I graduated around the same time.
Sure.
So that's
Sure.
I think when we think about this profession, wellness can sometimes fall by the wayside for a
Oh,
lot
yeah.
of counseling professionals, and this job is very emotionally demanding.
Mhm.
How do you like maintain your own wellness
Mhm.
and balance while you're supporting others with theirs?
Yeah. I think that's the literal question that we are always sitting with. It's in every research article on wellness. And so it's a good question. And I also like don't think I have the answer, but I'll tell you where I think I am myself. Um, what I do know is I did my time in agencies as a young therapist, and I recognized pretty early on in those early internships and early in my career, there was literally no way I could keep up the stamina of the requests for like the weekend programming I was doing, where I was working like 32 hours in a weekend. I was seeing my colleagues working like 8 to 9 hour days straight through with like a 30-minute break for lunch, making $20 to $24 an hour. And that is the reality for a lot of places, and I don't really think it should be, and I think all of us kind of inherently know that that's true, but we don't really know what to do with, "This isn't really working, but, like, this is the system that we're living in." We know that the length of time for counselors that stay at agencies is usually 2 to 3 years after getting a master's, which to me is, like, heartbreaking. Um, so because we know all of that to be true, then I think we have to have more conversations about what well-being actually looks like at a system level, because we can really only be as healthy as our systems. And that's my personal belief. Some people might not agree, but I think that that's true. Um, if the system at play, if I'm trying to focus on my wellness, but the system that I'm in is literally incapable of helping me do that, then my hands are tied. I can do my best individually, but like I said earlier, we're interdependent with our system, with our community being our mental health agency we work for, etc. So I think this needs to be a larger conversation, and I think it is, but I think it needs to be a continued conversation. So, truly for me, it's a very privileged thing for sure, but I knew that I wouldn't be giving good therapy in those situations, so I had to leave. I felt like to be successful in helping people and helping myself. So now, working in private practice for myself, I work the hours I want to work and I have the flexibility I need to be able to care for myself well, and then I can care for other people well too. So practically, really truly practically, like what that means for me is moving my body daily, eating throughout the day so I don't crash from lack of food and water,
Yeah.
texting and calling friends about my feelings, about situations that I don't feel comfortable with or I'm frustrated by, hanging out with my family, sleeping well, reading fantasy books and poetry, doing things that I enjoy. So I think that again looks different for everyone, but I'm very empathetic to folks that are in situations where it feels like those things are really, really hard to engage with because of how long their days are.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard, I feel like in the last few years, especially since the pandemic, a lot of BIPOC creators with the sentiment of like we can't self-care ourselves out of
Yeah.
like dysfunctional systems.
Yes.
And so I appreciate you speaking that as well. And that like, yeah, at baseline foundation, I can try and take care of myself. But if the community is in danger, like there's only so much that my own self-care and wellness is doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I appreciate those creators because they're right and they're bringing light to a topic that's so important. And I think in some ways, I hope what people hear from that is like, give yourself some like, cut yourself some slack, like, the
Mhm.
responsibility is not fully on you. There's some responsibility on you for sure, but it's not all on you, and we need to be having conversations with people, management, higher ups in our agencies and our places of employment and saying, realistically, like, we if we say we care about mental health, then we have to care not just about a client's mental health, but about the clinician's mental health too. And so what does that actually look like practically for each individual clinician that works for somewhere? And I would hope the more we have those conversations, the more people in those positions will hear it because they don't want to keep training new people as 2 to 3 years, every 2 to 3 years when there's an influx and then people leave. So I think we have to have those larger conversations for sure.
Yeah. So what would you suggest in terms of trying to make like these definitions of wellness a little bit more equitable or accessible across the board?
Yeah, so okay, here's my real feelings. So I sort of wish
Real here.
the yes. I sort of wish the counseling profession had used the term well-being instead of wellness.
Mm,
Because I think wellness has this connotation that we're focused on physical health only.
mm,
Even though wellness in our literature was never defined that way, I think that word comes with baggage, as many words do. Um, so I'm not sure the definitions of wellness in our field necessarily need to change, but I do think how we talk about it and how we unpack it and how we apply it for sure does. So,
mhm,
too many times we're actually purporting our own ideas of what we think wellness looks like for us and kind of putting
yeah,
it on other people like it should be this for you too. And I think we need to challenge those that we engage with to consider both internal and external factors for why we have arrived there and feel the need to put this on someone else and kind of expand our view of really what wellness looks like. And again, really focus on okay, instead of focusing on how this person isn't taking care of their wellness, what is the larger context to their life that might be challenging that? And can we go after the systems at play a little bit
mm,
more instead of just putting all the responsibility on the individual?
yeah. Oh, I like that. Yeah. And language matters so much. So like it's important that as a professional we're really aware of like how what we might be saying can be perceived, not just like what we mean,
Mhm.
how it may be digested from other people. Yeah. Oh.
Absolutely.
So when you think about people, maybe we have a lot of like newer folks that listen to the podcast who are either still in their training program or new
Mhm.
professionals. What advice would you give to someone who's considering this counseling career, especially maybe ones who want to focus on like well-being and wellness spaces integrated with, even though it's like part of our definition, integrated more
Sure.
intentionally with their practice?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, I think our field is so beautiful. I think sitting in front of someone who's healing in front of your eyes is like a sacred experience that I never take for granted, and I don't take lightly that I'm afforded the opportunity to be with people in some really dark places. And quite honestly, I wouldn't want to do anything else with my life. I, again, kind of stumbled into this field, but I'm so grateful that I did. Um, so I'd say that first and foremost, kind of keeping that at the front and center when you're getting into the field. When it comes to specializing in wellness, I think I'd recommend really sticking true to your beliefs around wellness and making it accessible for other people. So many people will come around, at least they did for me, and I hope maybe this is changing, but will come around and say so many things about, well, that's never going to work. And, all the other things that kind of downplay like the dream that you have around making what you do special and specializing in the thing that like really makes your heart come alive. And so, again, like I said earlier, just take everything with a grain of salt and then stick true to your path. You don't really have to do it everyone else's way. And I would encourage you to find mentors and other people who give you the space to figure it out the way you want to, while also, providing that structure and support that you might need when you're first starting out.
Hmm. Yeah, appreciate you saying that. I feel like ways are expanding, right?
Hmm.
Like when we think about a decade ago when we were coming coming into the field, like what were our options or what were we led to believe were our options
Hmm.
maybe? In
Yes.
in some ways, I hope that's shifting in counselor ed programs, even though there might not be a lot of formalized training on private practice. There's so many other opportunities now, I think because of the way this beautiful field is growing.
Yeah. To that end, I just remember, I remember at the time, and this is why advocacy work is important too. But I remember at the time in 2014, I remember having this conversation where we were still fighting for LPCs to be placed on job application or job descriptions that LSWs were being placed on. And I remember thinking, like, how is anyone in our field going to get a job if they just put LSWs and they don't put LPCs? And that someone fought for that. Someone
Mhm.
fought for us to get Medicare. Like, there are people that are advocating and doing this work so that you're right, that we're in a different place now than we were before. And so this is the thing I am passionate about. You don't have to be passionate about it, but find the thing you are passionate about and know that we're standing on the shoulders of counselors that have come before us. And you can also be that person too in whatever thing that you're passionate about. So yeah, I'm always looking back when I look forward and seeing the advocacy work that I'm doing. I'm always looking back and saying thank you to those people. Don't always know their names, but thank you to those people who've gotten us where we are today because it has opened doors for me to be able to do the things I'm doing now.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's great. That's I love everything you had to say. I'm like, no notes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just it's incredible to think about like that growth in these last 10
Mm,
years. Now, like moving forward from like this next decade, what the potential can be, especially
right.
now some of the newer things with like expansion and just the opportunities I think that are different because of telehealth and
Mhm.
that have changed since the pandemic. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's incredible to think about that future part and piece.
Mhm.
So, I know that we've talked about a lot in a wide gamut of things, and that there are experiences beyond that that you have had in your professional career. Is there anything else you feel like you would really want to share with listeners today? Like, especially maybe those who are interested in anything we've discussed that maybe your own experience of it could add to.
Um, that's a good question. I think I just add that, I'm available if you want to talk more about the journey I've had, or if you just need like a person to tell you you got this, tend to be a cheerleader in that way. Um, I also just really enjoy consulting with other people around their own private practice startups, and I am very passionate about equity and recognize that that's not always something that we can afford to do, but I have made it because I'm passionate about this. I'll not supervise, excuse me. I will consult with people, and in essence we come up with a fee system that in essence makes people not have to pay me until they start making money, because I think a lot of times what happens is they really do need a consultant on this. They need to figure out how to start, but usually you don't have the startup cash to pay someone to consult with, and I noticed that that was a barrier. And so if that's something that is stopping you from going after something that like this, that you're like, oh, I really want to do that, I just can't afford it,
Mhm.
I would really recommend reaching out to me, because I will make it make sense for you, because it's just something that I think is important. There's a lot of people that help me along the way that I am indebted to because of that, and I want to give back in that way. So, yeah, that's just something I like to let people know, because I think sometimes they're like, oh, well, they kind of almost take themselves out of the game, like, oh, well, she's probably too expensive. Yeah, I'll tell you my fee, but also I'll say, you don't have to pay me back until you start making money. And also, I'm not knocking on your door every day asking for it. I just assume that you'll pay it when you can.
Yeah.
And if I never get paid, that's also okay too. So that's something that I'm just, again, trying to make sure that people have access who don't have access normally. So that's what I would say too. Just if you need someone to give you some more information or to share more about this whole process, I am here to do that if that feels beneficial to you.
Yeah. And for those of you listening who are like, yeah, sign me up, we're going to make sure that Katie's info is in the show notes. So you'll have easy access to that information. And as we normally do on the show, not just putting show notes in, we ask the age old question that is true to the name of this podcast. It's called Ohio Counseling Conversations. What important conversations do you, Katie, think we should be having in the state as counseling professionals, either with each other or with our clients?
Yeah, so besides all the things we've already talked about, which I think are important, I think we need to continue to push for higher reimbursement rates from insurance companies so that counselors can continue to enter the field and stay well for themselves. I know a lot of the reasons why counselors get burnt out is they're working really hard for very little money. And so I want to keep having those conversations and keep pushing for reimbursement rates for insurance companies to increase. That's a part of wellness we don't often talk about, financial wellness. Counselors give and give and give and give and give. And it's really hard work to do when those reimbursement rates from insurance companies have literally been the same for the last 10 years. I know because I started in 2014 and it's 2024 and I get paid the same amount. So, I'm working right now on this with a few colleagues as a part of the Insurance Advocacy Committee, a part of OCA. I recognize that not everyone in our field has time and energy to do that. But if you're interested in that conversation, we meet once a month and I'd really love to see you there if that's something that's intriguing to you or you're passionate about that too. And I think just also we as counselors really need to be thinking about how we treat one another in the field. Just because it's been done this way, in parentheses, doesn't mean it's actually effective or helpful. And so I think we need to continue to move that needle um, on the care that we have for our clinicians, first and foremost, especially the managers or those in positions of authority. And again, I don't know if I've said this yet, but I'm not perfect. I know that I have things to work on. I know I have blind spots. So, it's also people in positions of authority saying, hey, have you thought about doing it this way? Or, hey, this is working really well for us. And it's really boosting morale. It's really caring for the clinicians well. So I think to really focusing on not just client care, but the clinician care as well. I think those are two really important conversations we need to keep having.
Yeah, and I really like that, like, what you're saying here is also saying, like, continuing the conversations, right?
Yeah.
Like, it is
Hmm.
advocacy isn't always just, like, being on the committee and talking about it, but also sharing with other people like, "Hey, like, what can we do?" And maybe it's just like, "Oh, you're interested in that? I know someone." And having
Hmm.
that snowball thing of like, I can give you a little bit of education or I can give you some insight, who to connect to, share a resource. That all of these things sort of help us build momentum and maybe get to those other outcomes of better reimbursement,
Hmm.
better interactions amongst other professionals, and what no matter what level you are, whether you're a new
Hmm.
professional or a leader in the field.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Keep the conversation going. Yeah. I love that.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the time that you've shared with us and in talking about things. And um, any plugs where people can find you, and keep in mind, we'll keep them in the show notes as well.
Yeah. So our website is probably the easiest way to find it. And then you can find all the other social media stuff through that. But it's just thewelllife.com. So THEWELLIFE. And our name, The Well Life, it's pretty appropriate given that we care about wellness. And so we want everyone to have a well life. So hopefully you find us there if you have more questions or need to reach out about anything.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. And thank
Yeah.
you for listening. We will see you back on our next episode of Ohio Counseling Conversations. Have a great one.
Ohio Counseling Conversations is on a mission to make this podcast meaningful to you, and we can't do that without your help. A feedback form is linked in the show notes for this episode and is also available on the OCA Linktree. If you have any recommendations for topics or guests or any other general feedback, you can let us know by using the form. We welcome your thoughts so that we can continue to develop the podcast and grow as creators. If you are interested in joining the team or being a guest, you can also reach us by emailing ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. We value your insight. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow us so you can stay up to date with Ohio Counseling Conversations online and wherever you listen to podcasts.
This podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Counseling Association's Media, Public Relations, and Membership Committee and its podcast subcommittee. This podcast features original music selections by Elijah Satoru-Wood and our closing song, Accretion Discotheque by Who AD. Views, beliefs, or references mentioned in this episode do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the Ohio Counseling Association. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect the view of the Ohio Counseling Association or any of its officials. Thank you.